Hello, everybody. Lovely to have you here for the final session in what has been, I think, a very memorable series on the Frozen Realms, the fourth installment of our six-semester exploration of natural landscapes and human meaning. In the fall, we turn our attention to the mountain. And to all that this imposing presence has meant to the human imagination. I'm not quite sure yet whether I'm going to call it the mountain or the mountains. So if you have any strong feelings about this, you can speak to me about it.
Spend the summer doing some focus groups on that.
So to bring everything to a close this semester, however, we have three splendid speakers who will talk to us about exploring the frozen realms. Hugh Ellis received his PhD in zoology from the University of Florida, Gainesville, and arrived at USD in 1980. He's professor in the Department of Biology, and his principal area of research is in the energetics of birds. Dr. Ellis has been a visiting research scientist at the University of Hawaii, Sydney University, Australia, and the Archbold Biological Station in Florida. Among his recent projects in the field of physiological ecology, he's been working in Svalbard in the high Arctic, on and off since 2012, on kittiwakes and Arctic terns, looking at the intersection between energy use, costs of migration, and the effects of pollution. Ron Kaufmann is Professor of Environmental and Ocean Sciences, Associate Dean for Programs and Curriculum in the College of Arts and Sciences, and he also oversees the interdisciplinary curriculum element of the Humanities Center's operations. He received his PhD from UCSD's Scripps Institution of Oceanography and specializes in environmental biology with an emphasis on the study of marine life in extreme environments, such as the Antarctic and the deep ocean. Dr. Kaufmann is, in addition, an expert on orchids. He is chair of the American Orchid Society Conservation Committee and co-author of the book Orchids of Tropical America. Ron kicked off the Frozen Realms series back in February, and it's great to have him back again for this last session. Bryson Patterson graduated from USD in 2022 with a degree in environmental science and political science. He is currently finishing a master's degree here, working with Dr. Beth O'Shea, who we're very happy to have back, welcome home, on the impact of wildfires on drinking water in California. He was one of the Keck Undergraduate Humanities Research Fellows here at the Humanities Center and did superb work on the concept of the sublime, particularly in relation to the representation of ice in painting and photography. Bryson is indeed an accomplished photographer whose photographs have been shown at the San Diego County Fair. And it must again be said, it is Bryson's haunting photograph that adorns the cover of the Humanities Center calendar this semester and was on the billboard, very poignantly present on Linda Vista Road. Thank you again for that, Bryson. It's a really, really magnificent image. So, for the very last time, let's explore the frozen realms. Over to you, Ron, Bryson, Hugh.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure. This has been a fun series, a lot of great presentations, and today we'll try to wrap it up by talking about exploring the frozen realms. I'm going to try to keep this as brief as I possibly can, given that there are three of us and we all have preview of coming attractions, fairly substantial slide decks. So I'm going to skip over some things here and there. As I was telling these gentlemen, in putting this talk together, it occurred to me that a 10-talk series of an hour each would still not be sufficient to cover just the topic that I'm going to cover, which is exploring the frozen realms, specifically the Antarctic. So Antarctica has been postulated, actually Aristotle first postulated that there must be an Antarctic continent given his understanding of the presence of a landmass in the Arctic. He didn't know it was mostly an ice sheet. And so when European it's actually thought that Polynesian seafarers probably discovered the Antarctic continent at some point between let's say, for example, 2,000 years ago and the year 1500, but we don't know. We have no records of that. The European explorers started looking for the Antarctic continent for a number of reasons. So, for example, Captain James Cook, the first European to cross the Antarctic Circle. The Antarctic Circle, by the way, is the latitude where on at least one day a year, the sun is either fully above the horizon or fully below the horizon, depending on the time of year. So south of that, you get these total darkness events or total light events, depending on what season you're talking about. But in the early 1800s, European explorers were trying to look for areas in the Antarctic to exploit seal and whale populations, in part because those populations in the Arctic had been so depleted by that time, and whales especially, but also seals were an important source of oil, and to a lesser extent, a source of meat. In the early part of the 1800s, there was a whole series of European explorers that made various firsts. So the continent was first sighted by Europeans, either by the Russian explorer von Bellingshausen or by the English explorer Bransfield, probably within a couple weeks of each other. Nathaniel B. Palmer, was the first European to set foot on the actual land of the Antarctic continent. James Weddell explored the oceans around Antarctica, and James Ross did some coastal exploration around 1840 with two ships, the Erebus and the Terror. For those of you who are familiar with Antarctic geography, these names will be very, very familiar because they're all over the Antarctic. There's Mount Erebus and Mount Terror are two of the large mountains. There's the Weddell Sea, there's the Palmer Peninsula, the Bransfield Strait, the Bellingshausen Sea, and so on and so on. These are the people who discovered and felt empowered to name various parts of the continent. By the early 1900s, which is where my talk more or less starts, there were a number of goals that had been set out. One was to explore the continent itself, now that the continent had been reached. Another was to advance science. So many of these expeditions, especially the British expeditions, were not just expeditions of exploration, they were expeditions of scientific discovery. And there were a few asterisks. I'll tell you a little more about that. Of course, an important goal was to reach the South Pole. Why? Because it's there. And so between 1897 and 1922, and I appreciate that some of you may not be able to see the bottom of the slide here, there were no fewer than 17 different individual expeditions to Antarctica involving representatives from 10 different countries. And this era has generally been dubbed the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. And I think you will, when I'm done with my talk, hopefully you will agree that heroism was an important part of the process. So a few things about Antarctica, the continent. It's about 40% larger than Europe. It is the highest continent, the coldest continent, the windiest continent, and the driest continent. When I say the highest, what I mean is the South Pole is at an elevation of over 9,000 feet. So if you are going to go from the coast to the South Pole, not only will you be going across a frozen wasteland, you will also be going up nearly 2 miles. It is the coldest continent. The average temperature at McMurdo Station, which is on the coast, by the way, not the interior, is 0 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the annual average temperature. The coldest temperature ever measured anywhere on Earth is in Antarctica. That's not a huge shock. Minus 128 degrees Fahrenheit. That's air temperature. That's got nothing to do with wind chill. That is just air temperature. It is the windiest continent. The average wind speed for the entire continent, average throughout the year, is about 13 miles an hour. The record at McMurdo, again on the coast, 116 miles an hour, and there have been nearly 200-mile-an-hour winds measured on Antarctica. And it is the driest. On average, is what you might call a polar desert. On average, less than 6 inches of rainfall a year. By comparison, San Diego, which we call a desert, has an average annual rainfall about 50% higher than that. So, if you are going to be an Antarctic explorer, this is what you have to contend with. Not for everyone. There were a number of attempts to reach the South Pole, and what I'm going to do basically for the rest of the talk is I'm going to talk about some of the expeditions, some of the people, what they encountered, what they did, and, well, that's pretty much it, just all that. So one of the first attempts was the British National Antarctic Expedition. This was led by Commander Robert Falcon Scott, the distinguished-looking gentleman in the upper right. He was a British Navy commander, And I'm going to throw some names around, in part because some of these names are going to come back. Also, the ship that they were on, the ship that they used to actually get to the continent was the Discovery, and some of these expeditions are known not just by the distinguished title, British National Antarctic Expedition, but also by the name of the vessel. So this included a number of individuals: Tom Crane, Ernest Shackleton, those two names will both come up again. Frank Wild, Edward Wilson, those two names also will come up again. Every single one of these gentlemen was involved in at least 2, sometimes as many as 3 or even 4 different expeditions to the Antarctic. The main purpose of this expedition was to do scientific research, geological exploration, and you'll notice it says there a magnetic survey, to locate and characterize the South Magnetic Pole was one of the initial objectives of some of these explorations. It was based at McMurdo Sound, which is, again, on the coast. The U.S. currently has a research base in that area, as does New Zealand. And I'm also going to mention something about the modes of transportation that these people attempted to use, because their outcomes were very strongly dictated in some cases by the mode of transportation that they selected. So in this case, it included Siberian sled dogs. Seems like a reasonable thing if you're going to go into a frozen area. However, none of the members of the party were particularly trained in the use of sled dogs to haul a sled. This will come back, as you might imagine. So this was, like I said, this is the initial attempt to reach the South Pole. The southern journey, the so-called southern journey, involved 3 people. It involved Scott, Shackleton, and Wilson, 3 of the men I mentioned. They were on the ice attempting this for nearly 3 months, or for right around 3 months, from November to February. Remember, the seasons are reversed, so this is the middle of summer. And they had a number of challenges. Nobody was really adept at the use of sled dogs, so they weren't very effective. There were issues with the food that the sled dogs had, and the sled dogs actually fell into poor health because their food wasn't appropriate. There were issues with scurvy. Scurvy, as we now know, is a vitamin C deficiency. It leads to a number of symptoms like bleeding gums and extreme weakness. These are extreme weakness when you're trying to walk to the South Pole, not a good characteristic. And so they dealt with those. Snow blindness, the reflectivity off of the snow led to issues of not being able to see clearly, and frostbite. And especially Shackleton was so weak by the end of the trip that he wasn't able to walk anymore. He took turns sort of alternately trudging alongside the sled and riding on the sled because he couldn't actually walk very well. They made it to within 410 miles of the pole. For context, the pole itself from where they started would have been about a 1,200-mile walk. So they made it about 2/3 of the way there, but then they had to turn back. In the process, though, they made a number of scientific discoveries, and Scott in particular. So this particular expedition, it was commanded by Scott, who was a Navy person, but it also had a number of scientists. So Edward Wilson was a scientist, for example, and they discovered the existence of the Antarctic dry valleys, which nobody knew existed, no satellites, right? So they didn't know. They thought everything was covered by ice. But in fact, the Antarctic has a number of dry valleys. These were discovered. They discovered an emperor penguin colony at Cape Crozier, which is not that far from McMurdo Station. Here's a photograph of that colony. That'll come back later as well. They discovered that the Ross Ice Shelf was actually a floating mass of ice, that it wasn't connected to the continent in any substantial way. They discovered a fossil of a leaf. That may not seem like much, but a fossil of a leaf implied that Antarctica had once had forests and plants, which unified Antarctica with some of the other continents that were known to exist. And this was also the expedition where they first were able to accurately calculate the location of the South Magnetic Pole, which from a navigation perspective is huge. So there were a lot of accomplishments. Reaching the South Pole was not one of them. That did, however, lead to a second British Antarctic expedition, and this involved a ship called the Nimrod. Now, the Nimrod, this expedition was led by Shackleton. This is a picture of Shackleton in better times. He was an Irish explorer. And again, the purpose of this trip, as most of the Antarctic trips by the British, were scientific research, geological exploration, and, oh, by the way, an attempt to reach the South Pole. So again, they were based at McMurdo Sound. Again, they included Siberian sled dogs, but this time they added ponies. I'll let you think about that for a second. And motorized sleds, the forerunner of the snowmobile, if you will. And again, there was a pole attempt. This involved Shackleton and 3 others, including Frank Wild, who'd been on the previous expedition, on the Discovery expedition. They had a number of challenges. The ponies didn't work out the way they expected that they might, not surprisingly, and ultimately, and just so you know, this will come up over and over again, they were ultimately slaughtered for food because they did need food. They had figured out by then that even though they didn't know what scurvy was caused by, they didn't know it was vitamin C deficiency, they knew that it happened, and they knew that eating fresh meat would reduce the effects, or actually would eliminate the effects of scurvy. So by then they realized that they needed to eat fresh meat, and that meant seals, penguins, ponies, whatever they had access to. There were still, however, they had intestinal issues, they had enteritis issues, they had a number of digestive problems that also led to weakness. The previous trip, you remember, well, you may not remember, 93 days, right, to get closer to the pole and back. They had budgeted food for 93 days. It ultimately took them 123 days to get to within just over 100 miles of the pole and back. And they were sort of in a difficult bind because the Nimrod, the ship, had been left at McMurdo Sound with strict instructions to leave, irrespective of what happened with the party, to leave and head back north to England on March 1st. And again, they essentially calculated 90 days or so to get to the pole and back. It took them an additional month, and you'll notice the date there. They got back to McMurdo Sound on February 28th, the day before they had instructed the ship to leave. So they made it back in time. Nobody died, but they didn't make it to the pole. They turned back about 112 miles away. There were some major accomplishments. So while they were attempting to make it to the pole, the rest of the scientific party actually summited Mount Erebus, if you can imagine climbing to the top of a 12,000-foot mountain in the Antarctic, not wearing light climbing gear. They did a geological survey of the dry valley, and there was a northern party that did, for the first time, manage to actually make it to the South Magnetic Pole. So even though they didn't make it to the geographic South Pole, they at least made it to the South Magnetic Pole, a separate party. Just to give you a sense of, so here's Shackleton in better times. I don't know if you guys can see this photograph. This is Shackleton and companions on the Nimrod after they made it to within 112 miles of the pole. So Shackleton. Looked a little grim, but survived, actually survived. So 2 failed attempts to get to the pole. The third one, now we go back to Scott. And this was the so-called Terra Nova expedition. Again, we're a few years later, now it's 1910. There were 65 men involved. 7 were veterans of the Discovery expedition from about 10 years earlier. Again, they went to McMurdo Sound. Again, sled dogs, ponies, and motor sleds. This is a repeated theme for the British, it seems, or for the British at this time. And there was a side, so while they were at McMurdo Sound getting ready, there was a side trip. This is the so-called winter journey to Cape Crozier. So geography, McMurdo Sound is here. Where they were staying was right around here near Cape Evans. And Cape Crozier, where the emperor penguin colony had been discovered, was over here. This is a little over 60 miles away. So not that far. It's like driving from here to San Onofre, basically. It's not that far. Or to San Clemente is probably better. So it's not that far in actual miles. However, they set, because they were doing this during the winter, they set out on June 27th. They came back on August 1st, right? So we're talking about roughly 5 weeks. And it was these 3 gentlemen. It was so-called Bertie Bowers. This is Wilson here, and this is a gentleman named Apsley Cherry Garrard, and there's a whole story you could tell about just Cherry Garrard. But the goal of this was to get emperor penguin eggs. Why did they want emperor penguin eggs? They wanted emperor penguin, not because they wanted to make a southern omelet, no. They wanted emperor penguin eggs for 2 reasons, both of which turned out to be wrong. The first reason was it was thought, because emperor penguins were flightless, that they were very primitive birds. And so the notion was that if you could get an insight into the embryo of an emperor penguin, you would get an insight into the evolutionary history of birds. That was one idea. The second idea was this old, for those of you in the audience who are biologists, this old misnomer that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is that the development of an animal, during its development, an animal goes through all of the evolutionary stages that led to that animal to begin with. Also not true. So they wanted to get emperor penguin eggs at an early stage of development so they could dissect them to see what the evolutionary origins of birds were. And In order to get there and get back, remember, 5 weeks, they hauled 2 sleds with roughly 250 pounds of gear per person, gear and supplies, man-hauled them during the Antarctic winter from McMurdo Sound all the way around to Cape Crozier and back. Daily temperatures averaged around -70. I'm not talking about wind chill, I'm talking about air temperatures. And it was mostly dark most of the time. They all 3 survived. They got 3 eggs, those exact 3 eggs. That's a photograph that was taken at the time. And this was dubbed by Cherry Garrard, quote, the worst journey in the world, unquote. He wrote a book with that title that deals in part with that trip. Actually, interesting little side note about Cherry Garrard. George Bernard Shaw was a good friend of his. He was the one who suggested that title. So, literary connection for those of you who are interested in Bernard Shaw. So they made it back. This was a side trip. This was not the main purpose of the expedition. This was just, well, we have some time during the winter, let's do this. So this was a side trip. Back to the main action, Scott and company made what they called the South Polar Journey, and they left camp in November, which is early summer, late spring, early summer, with 12 men. On the way, the motor sleds failed, so they had to discard those. And instead, these 12 men hauled 740 pounds of supplies on sleds 150 miles. So that would be like putting 740 pounds of supplies on some sleds. 150 miles is basically here to Ventura, man-hauling sleds. So over ice at minus whatever. So they did all this, and there was a very important strategy. The idea was they were going to go partway with 12 men, then send some men back, and the original goal was to send 8 men back to base. They had left supply depots along the way so that when the polar party turned around and came back, they could go from depot to depot and didn't have to haul all of their supplies all the way there and all the way back. This is very clever. It actually works pretty well most of the time. And so one of the interesting things that happened was they were originally intending to have 4 men go to the pole. Instead, Scott later on decided to have 5 men make the polar attempt. And they actually did reach the South Pole on January 17th, 2012. Sorry, that should say 1912. When I was typing this over and over again, my fingers kept going 20, 20, 20. And I had to go back and edit out the 20s and make them 19s. I missed that one. On the return trip, there were a number of problems that occurred. There were specific injuries that led the men to be somewhat infirm, frostbite, lack of fuel. They didn't have enough fuel in the depots, so they weren't able to use their stoves to actually keep warm. They ran into unexpected bouts of bad weather that shut them down for periods of days at a time, so they had to stay in their tents and couldn't make any progress. It is estimated, based on our best understanding from diaries and dates, that Scott, Bowers, and Wilson all died right around March 30th. The other 2 members went off on their own to either died earlier or in one case kind of like wandered off and died later. They were about 11 miles from their next food depot. And some of that will come back later. There's another sort of additional tragedy to this, if you will, which is that about the same time, this fellow, Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian, was starting off also to try to get to the South Pole. And Amundsen's interest in this was, he actually had wanted to be the first to get to the North Pole. And he was planning to do that, but then word came back that other people had reached the North Pole. That turned out to be incorrect later. And so in 1926, he was the first person to make it to the North Pole, but that was much later. So instead, he fixed his sights on the South Pole. Amundsen assembled a party. They used the Fram, a boat that will come back later when Bryson talks. And it was a much smaller party, 19 men instead of 65, and he selected people who were expert skiers and expert carpenters who could, for example, fix skis if they broke or fix sleds if they broke. He brought with him 100 Greenland sled dogs, skis, Inuit-style clothing made of sealskin and reindeer skin, basically the clothing that is worn by people who live in polar climates in other parts of the world. And in terms of a march to the pole, he and 4 other men departed camp on October 19th, 2011, so they actually set off a couple weeks before Scott. Interestingly enough, they were moored in the Bay of Whales, which is sort of a little bit away from McMurdo Sound, and it's 67 miles closer to the pole than McMurdo. the Terra Nova was actually sailing around in the area, came to the Bay of Whales, saw that they were there, had a conversation. Amundsen said, well, you know, if you'd like to make camp here, you're more than welcome to. They declined, went back to McMurdo Sound. So things could have gone differently. So Amundsen and company left a couple weeks before Scott and company. Scott and company were making about 10 miles a day on a good day, 12 maybe on a very good day. Amundsen's diaries indicate that they were surprised at how fast their progress was. They were making 18 to 20 miles a day, regularly on the way to the pole uphill, over territory they'd never actually seen before. It was unfamiliar. They knew about it from stories, but none of them had ever actually been there before. And they reached the pole on December 14th, about a month before the Scott party made it there. And in fact, they erected a tent, they put up the Norwegian flag, and Amundsen left a written letter for Scott, knowing that Scott was on the way, that Scott apparently got when he got there. They returned January 25th, 2012, covering 2,150 miles in less than 100 days, and with no loss of life and apparently with no major inconvenience. So very, very different outcomes. And so just to sort of show this graphically, on the left side you can see this is the Scott party. They started off over here. This is the Amundsen party. Went up this direction, made it to the pole, came back down, and then various party members, so Evans died here, Oates died here, and Scott Wilson and Bowers died right in here. And again, this was a fairly straightforward kind of journey in far less time and with much better outcomes. So this is, there was sort of an interesting coda to all of this, if you will. So this is Apsley Cherry Garrard, the one I mentioned, who wrote the book, The Worst Journey in the World. And this is a quote from him. I've pieced together a few things, so I'll just read this real quickly. I now see very plainly that though we achieved a first-rate tragedy, which will never be forgotten just because it was a tragedy, tragedy was not our business. I see not one journey to the pole, but two, in startling contrast one to another. On the one hand, Amundsen going straight there, getting there first, and returning without the loss of a single man, and without having put any greater strain on himself and his men than was all in the day's work of polar exploration. On the other hand, our expedition, running appalling risks, performing prodigies of superhuman endurance, achieving immortal renown, commemorated in august cathedral sermons and by public statues, yet reaching the pole only to discover our terrible journey superfluous and leaving our best men dead on the ice. To ignore such a contrast would be ridiculous. Very eloquent and tragic. The last piece I'm going to mention, and I'll try to wrap this up fairly quickly. Now that the pole had been reached, and that was no longer a goal, Ernest Shackleton, who had been on the first Discovery expedition and on the Nimrod expedition, pulled together funding and was able to mount the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition on a ship called the Endurance. This involved 28 men, a number of whom were Discovery veterans, so they'd been to the Antarctic multiple times before. There were two ships. There was actually the Endurance, which was supposed to come into the Weddell Sea, or Weddell, depending on your pronunciation, and make a trip via the South Pole to the other side of the continent. And the second ship, the Aurora, was to come into the Ross Sea and lay out a series of supply depots along this route so that the Shackleton party could match up, or could meet up with them and then use the supply depots to get back down to the sea. They left South Georgia Island, which is right up here, in December of 2014, and very quickly encountered unexpectedly heavy pack ice. So between December 2014 and February 2015, they made uneven progress, and by Valentine's Day again, that should all be 1914, 1915. I'm telling you, my fingers are just, so all 19. They were stuck in the pack ice, and any attempts to free the ship were unsuccessful. So I'm going to show you a few examples of photographs. I don't have as much text on these next slides. So this is the crew of the Endurance, February 7th, 1915. You can see open water behind them. A week later, they were stuck in the ice and using breaker bars and pry bars to try to open up a channel enough to get the ship out. That was a lot of work and ultimately unsuccessful. And so eventually the ship froze into the ice. And the notion at that point was to essentially let the ship stay there frozen in the ice during the Antarctic winter and then wait for the ice to break up in the spring and resume the voyage. That was the general notion. But it turns out that sea ice isn't as simple as it might seem to be. So sea ice is one of those interesting things. There's seasonal sea ice that surrounds the Antarctic continent. At the top, you can see the summer minimum, so there's relatively little sea ice. In the winter, the sea ice expands and can actually have an equal area to the Antarctic continent itself. And sea ice, which might be imagined to be relatively smooth and featureless like this, usually this is on the order of 1 to maybe a few meters thick, is actually anything but. Sea ice is extremely dynamic. Plates of sea ice break up and spread apart to form these channels that are called leads, like this. And so it's possible to sail through a lead if you're lucky. On the other hand, plates can come together and push up what are called pressure ridges. And these pressure ridges can be meters thick, 5 or even 10 meters thick. And if you're in a pressure field, so you can see a lead up there at the top with pressure ridges here, it's very uneven. If you're in a high pressure field and you're on a ship, that can be a potentially bad situation. So, like I said, the plan was for the Endurance, and Frank Wild was the photographer who, despite all of the adversity that I'm about to tell you about, carried with him over 100 photographic plates that now represent an excellent photographic record of what happened during the trip. And you can find some of these online if you're interested, and others in books. So you can see that the terrain here is really pretty rugged. So like I said, the notion was to have the ship weather it out and have the ice melt in spring and everything fine. But by August 1915, it was in a pressure field that started to compress the ship. And so you can see here the ship listing to port. It eventually did recover a little bit, but then it was compressed in another pressure field to the point where it keeled over like this by late October, excuse me. And so there were 3 lifeboats. You can see the lifeboats up here. There were 3 lifeboats that the men removed from the ship. They removed as many supplies as they could possibly get off the ship. They set up a camp on the ice itself. And by late October, the Endurance had been fairly well crushed, and it finally sank on November 21st, 1915, not 2015. What was the next option? Well, there was an island that Shackleton knew about, only a few hundred miles away. So they set out to haul the lifeboats, 3 lifeboats, across the ice. They were making very slow progress. The terrain was very rugged, so they only made about 1 mile a day. And if you sort of divide 300 by 1, you'll see that that would have taken them a long time. So they eventually gave up and made an ice camp and waited for the ice to break up. The challenge was that when the ice broke up, it did that very, very rapidly. And so in early April of, again, 1916, the ice floe began to break up, and they set out in lifeboats to cross this body of water and eventually get to Elephant Island, which is right here. And right here you can see a photograph. This is Elephant Island taken from the water, from more or less from sea level. And they eventually landed. You can see the topography is incredibly rugged. They eventually landed on a place that they dubbed Cape Wild, named after Frank Wild. And I actually had a number of years ago when I was on an Antarctic cruise, we had a little bit of time at the end of the cruise, and we were in the neighborhood. So we actually had a chance to go into Cape Wild, so I've been there. It's a fascinating place. I'll show you some photographs in a second here. So they hauled out at Cape Wild. This is what Cape Wild looks like from the water. So it doesn't look like there's much there. The terrain is very abrupt, lots of ice, lots of rock. And where they eventually hauled up their lifeboats was in this location right here. You'll see there's a monument. I can say more about that later. But basically, it is a spit of land sheltered a little bit from one side. When you go there, and you can go there as a tourist, you'll see lots of penguins typically. And they took the 2 of the lifeboats, inverted them, and essentially made shelters out of them with tarps and everything else that they had, while they prepared the 3rd lifeboat, called the James Caird, for an ocean voyage, and you'll see where this is going in a second. So they raised the gunnels to make it higher above the waterline. They put a top on it, and about 10 days later, the James Caird set out for South Georgia Island, where Shackleton knew there was a whaling station. This is an 800-mile journey across open water. We'll get to that in a second. There were 6 men on the boat, and they had supplies for roughly 4 weeks. So that means you got to make roughly 200 miles a week. This is a very interesting part of the world. So if you look at the geography of where they are, so just to sort of recap a little bit, this is where the Endurance becomes trapped in the ice. Over the course of the winter, it drifted here. eventually broke up and sank. Then they hauled the lifeboats across, but they built shelters. The ice further circulated. The ice broke up. They made it to Elephant Island, and then the James Caird took off for South Georgia Island. I don't know if you can tell from this picture, but this is all open water right here. And now I just need to say a little bit about oceanography, a very little bit. So the location that we're talking about is in what is called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which is the only current, major ocean current on Earth that is in an area where there's no land that it can encounter. It simply goes around and around and around and around and around like this. And so some of the worst weather in the world is in this area. And what they were trying to do was get from here to here. Open water. The challenge is, or one of the challenges is, if they miss the island, the next land body they encounter is South Africa. And it's way, way, way more than 4 weeks later. So it's an all or nothing kind of thing. To make matters worse, the weather during this time was overcast, mostly overcast. And the way that you navigate in these kinds of situations is you use a sextant to determine the angle of the sun above the horizon in relation to the time of day. But if you can't see the sun, it's a bit of a problem. So the person who was navigating was Worsley, who'd been the commander of the captain of the Endurance. And he estimates that on that trip, he was able to get maybe 2 good fixes on the sun in the entire time they were traveling. Nonetheless, they actually hit South Georgia Island, where they ran into a second problem. South Georgia Island is not flat. South Georgia Island is very, very rugged. This is an aerial photograph of South Georgia Island. The island itself looks something like this. And the only place they were able to find to pull in was what is called King Haakon Bay, right in here. And the whaling station that they wanted to get to was here. And there was no way to go back out here and navigate with the boat any way around the island without risking the possibility of going off toward Africa. So they left the 3 weakest men at the boat, and Shackleton, Worsley, and Crane walked over land, over ridges something like 3,000 feet high, multiple ridges, 26 miles without sleeping in a period of around 36 hours. So a couple of things. First of all, to even get them here, that navigation that Worsley used to get them to this island has been characterized as probably the greatest open ocean navigation experience in the last century. And this was just a completely, nobody had ever walked across South Georgia before. It's the first time. Nonetheless, they did it, they managed to get through it, and they showed up at this whaling station. Actually, the thing they didn't know is there was another whaling station right here that was only seasonally occupied. Shackleton thought it was empty, but in reality it wasn't. It was occupied, and they could have gone there. They just didn't know. So they walk all the way across South Georgia, stumble into the whaling station. Shackleton sees somebody he knows well, and the guy didn't even recognize him. He just so completely emaciated and covered with soot and all sorts of other things. So that's kind of the end of that part of the story. What happened later was, and this is a quote from Frank Worsley, who wrote an excellent book about the experience. It was a human experience in every sense, referring to the expedition and the voyage as a whole. Eventually, after 4 attempts, Shackleton was able to get back to Cape Wild and rescue his men. Not a single person died on this entire trip, and they were at it for almost 2 years. Absolutely incredible. If you're interested in reading more about any of this, there are some excellent books I can recommend. Absolutely, Cherry Garrod wrote this book called The Worst Journey in the World, First-Hand Account. Shackleton's boat journey was written by Frank Worsley, who was the captain of the Endurance, and of course, Shackleton himself wrote a book called South. And Sir Raymond Priestley, who was on 2 of the expeditions I mentioned, said, just sort of to summarize a little bit about what I said, for scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Amundsen. But when you're in a hopeless situation, when you are seeing no way out, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. And so just as to wrap this up completely, in March, and this is 2022, in March 2022, the Endurance was actually discovered on the bottom of the Weddell Sea at a depth of 3,000 meters, 4 miles from the position that Worsley had recorded where it sank. This guy was a heck of a navigator. And you can see this is the stern of the ship, and let's see. And you can even see this very, very well preserved, minus a few anemones. So with that, thank you all very much. I'm sorry I ran a little long, but appreciate your attention.
All right. Hi, everybody. Such a huge privilege to be up here again. This really is just the gift that keeps on giving. So I'm going to talk. It won't be quite as long as Ron's, quite as detailed, but we're going to talk a bit about the Romantic sublime, just as a way of kind of describing how the general public viewed the Arctic at the time. I think I like to compare it to how maybe one day we'll view space, or how people viewed space in the 60s, but they truly had no idea what these people were up against. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the Terror and the Erebus, their northern journey. Ron talked a bit about their southern journey. Nansen and Amundsen, and then the North Cape, which was the inspiration for this entire project to begin with. So I'm going to start off with a few quotes. Burke, which was the inspiration for this entire speaker series, as I'm sure you guys know. Burke doesn't talk explicitly about ice or the Arctic at any point in his book. However, a lot of his themes are captured by writers and artists from the Romantic period. So these are themes such as silence, loud noises, solitude, vastness. All of these things are captured in the poems or the passages that I'm about to read from. So Samuel Coleridge, writing in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, writes, "And through the drifts, the snowy cliffs, did send a dismal sheen. Nor shapes of men, nor beasts we ken, the ice was all between. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled, like noises in a swound." So you're going to notice, both from Ron's presentation and mine, that ice was the chief foe that most of these explorers were up against. That was written in 1798. Writing in 1806, in a book about shipwrecks, Clark writes, "As the subsequent pages of the present one display, under various points of view, the dreary but sublime scenery of the North Pole, I cannot better prepare the minds of my readers for the contemplation of those vast and watery deserts." This comes up with Nansen when he writes his book about his experiences, describing them as watery deserts. Lord Byron, writing in 1816 in the Alps with Mary Shelley, says, "Above me are the Alps, the palaces of nature, whose vast walls have pinnacled in clouds their snowy scalps, and throned eternity in icy halls of cold sublimity, where forms and falls the avalanche, the thunderbolt of snow. All that expands the spirit yet appalls, gather around these summits, as to show how earth may pierce to heaven, yet leave vain man below." So again, this obsession with ice as this being that is productive of the sublime. Moving a bit closer to the Arctic itself, Eleanor Ann Porden, upon meeting Franklin, who she later married, Franklin from the expeditions from some expeditions that I'll talk about, wrote, "Awful it is to gaze on shoreless seas, but more to view those restless billows freeze. One solid plain, or when the mountains piled, whole leagues in lengths of forms sublimely wild." So now we're beginning to move to the Arctic. 1818 is the year that the British truly kick off their Arctic expeditions. And again, in this year, and most notably, Mary Shelley in Frankenstein, through the captain that discovers Dr. Frankenstein in the Arctic, writes, "I try in vain to be persuaded that the pole is the seat of frost and desolation. It ever presents itself to my imagination as the region of beauty and delight. There, snow and frost are banished, and, sailing over a calm sea, we may be wafted to a land surpassing in wonders and in beauty every region hitherto discovered on the habitable globe." So there are two sides to this idea of the Arctic that they have in the Romantic period. You see people talking about the horror of the ice. You see Coleridge talking about the sounds that it makes as it crushes. And then we see this sense of wonder that Mary Shelley evokes from her captain. It may be a bit misguided, but he talks later about the open polar sea that they might discover up there. Some of the expeditions that I'll talk about disprove that. And this painting is called "The Sea of Ice." This is perhaps the most evocative of what these authors were capturing. But you'll notice the ship crushed under the weight of the sea ice, that Ron was talking about. So, Franklin's Lost Expedition. This is, if you divide the British Arctic experience into 3 distinct time frames, you'll have the pre-Franklin expedition, the Franklin expedition, and the post-Franklin expedition. The pre-Franklin expedition was a bit more successful for the British. This began in 1818, and they explored the Arctic. Franklin was up there several times, and they began to build a sense of hubris that these were the ones to conquer the Northwest Passage. So in 1845, Franklin sets out to do just this. The 2 ships you see on the left are the Terror and the Erebus on their Antarctic adventure, and on the right you see a painting from 1846, the year after the expedition set out, of the Erebus in the ice. You'll note that the Erebus is not frozen into the ice in this painting. They didn't know just how bad the expedition was going until 3 years after it had left. The expedition itself was an enormous failure. They set out with 128 men to try and just brute strength their way through the Northwest Passage. They chose 2 of the largest ships that they had available, one of which was actually involved in the battle that inspired the Star-Spangled Banner. So it's kind of fun. But these men, pretty much from the get-go, were not off to a good start. Both ships were trapped, crashed in the ice, and disappeared without a trace. So 3 years after, when their supplies had run up, the British decided to begin sending out rescue parties. These were not nearly as successful as they would have hoped, and ended up costing the British more men and ships than the Terror and the Erebus expeditions to begin with. On the right, you see a painting from a cartoon from a newspaper, just showing what was waiting for these British explorers when they reached the Arctic. If you can't tell, it's a skull saying welcome, and in the foreground there are some human bones. And on the left, you see a painting of one of the rescue ships itself that got stuck and then required subsequent rescue. As these rescues began to come back, they started to uncover more and more details of what had happened to the Terror and the Erebus. They began to discover some graves. They began to discover notes that were left behind saying when the ships had been abandoned, where the men had gone. But one of the more troubling revelations, and one that was not met very kindly by the public, was that the Inuits began to tell these men that the survivors had resorted to cannibalism, which in part inspired this painting that you see here. If you look closely, you'll see human remains with the polar bear on the right and the Union Jack and the polar bear on the left. This is an 1864 painting, so several years after these accusations, I guess, of cannibalism were lofted. But the public met those original accusations very sternly. Charles Dickens wrote that there was no way that their brave and enterprising countrymen had resorted to cannibalism. But, yeah. Something fun you'll see in the picture on the left side, this is very similar to Ron's last slide of the discovery of the Endurance under the sea ice, is where the ships were abandoned and trapped in the ice. So you'll see above King William Island. And then below that, you'll see 2 blue circles. And this is where the Canadian Parks searched for the 2 ships for years. I mean, the British sent. And no trace of them was ever discovered until 2014, actually. 2014 and 2016, respectively. These ships were discovered perfectly intact. There's nothing to decay up there under the ice, which has been awesome. They're still pulling up artifacts, and I was fortunate enough to see some of those when I was over in Norway at a museum that I'll talk about a bit later. Shifting gears a little bit to a much more successful Norwegian, you'll see a trend here. Fridtjof Nansen was born in 1861. He was a 12-time national cross-country skiing champion. Again, pretty important. Got a PhD in zoology and became the first to lead an expedition to cross Greenland by land. So this is where he really relied on his cross-country skiing experience. And at the end of it, when they reached the coast, they spent 4 months waiting to be picked up, where they actually learned from the natives all of the skills that they would later need for their polar expedition. So this is where they learned what type of clothes they needed to wear, how to work the dogs, and they learned how to kayak, which you see in this picture, down below, which proved very important for Nansen later. And most interestingly, he went on to get the 1922 Nobel Peace Prize, entirely unrelated to his work in the polar regions. So for his voyage to the North Pole later, Nansen had been inspired by the discovery of a U.S. Arctic expedition ship called the Janet. The Janet was frozen up near the Siberian Islands up here. Not related to this picture yet. And then 3 years later, the wreckage, it was abandoned. And then 3 years later, the wreckage was discovered in southwestern Greenland. So this began to get people thinking about this idea of the ice flows moving across the Arctic. And Nansen was inspired by this to build a ship to intentionally freeze in the ice and move across the North Pole. So based on where the Janet was frozen and where it ended up, they decided that this was only possible if you went directly across the North Pole. Very convenient. So Nansen commissioned the Fram, which is the ship that Ron talked about, to do just this. So very differently from the Terror and the Erebus and the Endurance, the Fram was a 12-man ship, so a very small crew, built out of just the strongest wood they could find. I have a picture later from inside the Fram. Spoiler alert, it was successful. The ship is in a museum now. But the Fram was perfectly designed to ride in what they thought was going to be the shallow sea. So up until this point, they believed that the Arctic Sea was not nearly as deep as it is. So very short hull, very small hull, and the goal of the plan for the ship was to float above the ice for 3 years, drift across the North Pole, and then come out and sail back. You'll see in the image on the left, the route in red is the path the ship took, and then the route in black is where Nansen decided that once they started drifting away from the pole and it became evident that the ship was never going to cross it, they were going to set out on foot with their skis and their kayaks to attempt to reach the North Pole on their own. So they made it all the way up to the 86th parallel, Nansen becoming the man that went the farthest north at this point, before they decided they needed to turn around. So on their return trip, this is where Nansen's adventure gets a little more interesting. It was July at this point, and the ice had begun to break up, so they started relying more and more on their kayaks and less on their skis at one point. So you'll see they went up north, turned around, came back down, knowing that they were going to meet other explorers that were up there. So on their way back, they ran into some issues with a walrus that attacked one of the kayaks. Nansen's kayak was out of commission. They made it to land, set up, starting to repair the kayak, and they heard a dog barking. So this clued them into the fact that rescue might be nearby, and Nansen went out looking for the dog and actually ran into a man that had applied to be on his expedition in the first place, but was instead on a different expedition that was trying to reach the North Pole by land. So again, this is the world in which these people are operating. They think there's a land path to the North Pole. They think it's a shallow sea. They think that maybe there's an open polar sea. So these people have absolutely no idea the things that we know about the North right now. So on that ill-fated adventure by land to the North Pole, Nansen runs into Jackson. Yes. And then Ever, the photographer, Nansen makes him go back 2 hours later to recreate them meeting. Dog in the background, very forced handshake in the foreground. But you'll see this is Nansen and the one companion that he set off to the pole with. And then they were able, on a previous slide, you'll see that the Fram went all the way back around, and they were both reunited in northern Norway, having neither of them having any idea that the other party was still alive. So the Fram Museum is in Norway, and this is the Fram itself. They built a museum around it. It is one of the most incredible places that I've been. You can see fairly small ship, but inside you can just appreciate the size of the wooden beams that were used to construct this, just to withstand the pressures of the ice. And you're able to walk around inside of it, and it's incredible. Briefly, we're all touching briefly on this guy. He deserves his own presentation. But Roald Amundsen, another Norwegian explorer, definitely the most successful explorer of the bunch, is described as the biggest, the strongest, the bravest, and generally the best-dressed man for sudden emergencies. A very, very successful explorer, first to sail across the Northwest Passage in a different boat called the Joe. Also, I don't know how to pronounce that one, though. also in the Fromm Museum. And then, as Ron had described, the first to reach the South Pole. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the northern Norwegian area, in particular the North Cape. So the impetus for this Humanities Center project with Brian was a class I took with Beth and Brian way back in 2020. And before taking the class, I saw this painting, decided it was a beautiful painting, took a picture of it. I did not take a picture of the author or anything like that, had no idea who painted it. But it went on to be an important part of my work, went back to the museum that it was in Europe, and then found the author. And just became obsessed with his work. And I'm going to show you a brief slideshow of the North Cape, which was incorrectly believed to be the northernmost point in Europe. It's actually slightly to the west of it, very close. Like you can see the other from there. But for a long time, this was the northernmost point in Europe. And although it's not, oceanographic Arctic exploration, it definitely was a place that people spent a lot of time and money reaching and bringing back stories from that helped to drive the romantic interest in the Arctic. This passage goes, "The vast expanse of the frozen ocean opened to our left, and we arrived at the extremest point of Europe, known by the name of the North Cape, exactly at midnight. The North Cape is an enormous rock, which, projecting far into the ocean and being exposed to all the fury of the waves and the outrage of tempests, crumbles every year more and more into ruins. Here everything is solitary, and everything is sterile, everything sad and despondent. The shadowy forest no longer adorns the brow of the mountain. The singing of the birds, which enlivened even the woods of Lapland, is no longer heard in this scene of desolation. The ruggedness of the gray rock is not covered by a single shrub. The only music is the hoarse murmuring of the waves, ever and anon renewing their assaults on the huge masses that oppose them. The northern sun, creeping at midnight at the distance of 5 diameters along the horizon, and the immeasurable ocean in apparent contact with the skies, form the grand outlines in the sublime picture presented to the astonished spectator. The incessant cares and pursuits of anxious mortals are recollected as a dream. The various forms and energies of animated nature are forgotten. The earth is contemplated only in its elements and as constituting a part of the solar system." So with that, I will leave you with the rest of these images and to think about the sublime and these journeys to the Arctic.
This is a very different kind of a talk. What I want to do is, a lot of you know I've been working in Svalbard on and off for about 10 or so years. I thought I would take you up with me and show you what it's like. It is sort of like a travel log, right? Except I'm going to end up taking you into the work that I've been doing recently and continuing doing. So a few of you that have been generous enough to award me faculty research grants can see where the money's being spent. So we're going to do a quick visit to Svalbard. You sort of need to buckle your seatbelts because we're going to go through a lot of slides pretty fast. And then we're going to get to this issue of the paradox of the Arctic tern, in which I am basically going to argue that the Arctic tern, which is an iconic bird of the Arctic, of polar regions, it actually migrates from the high Arctic to the Antarctic and back every year for about 30 years. It is thought to travel the equivalent of from here to the moon 4 times in its lifetime. There is no other animal that migrates longer than this migration. I'm going to argue that this icon of the Arctic is really not a polar bird, and so we're going to have to see how that works. But let's begin by acknowledging where Svalbard is. You can see it is well into the Arctic Circle. It is about 700 miles from the North Pole. It is at a latitude equivalent to the north of Greenland. And we are going to visit 2 places. We're going to visit Longyearbyen, which is the main town of Svalbard. And then I'm going to take you to Ny-Ålesund, which is actually, in spite of what you were told in the previous talk, this is really the most northern village in the world. And let's take a look at Svalbard a little closer. It's really an archipelago of a series of islands that are linked by ice. The biggest island is Spitsbergen. Here you can see in red Longyearbyen on this huge fjord called Isfjorden. And then Ny-Ålesund, which began life as a coal mine, is now a scientific village on another fairly large fjord, which I'll show you, which is Kongsfjorden. I want to start, though, in Norway, because, you know, we've had all this to do about the sun recently and the eclipse, and I'm very impressed, but I want to show you something which I think is also pretty impressive. There we are. This is, I have a collaborator in Tromsø, which is just barely into the Arctic Circle. Tromsø is a city in Norway, and this collaborator of mine, who you'll see in several slides, who several of you know because he did a sabbatical here in my lab a few years ago, Gabrielson. This is from his home. You are looking at the sun peeking out on the first day that the sun reappears after the winter darkness. If you measure the day's length as sunrise to sunset, this day lasted 4 minutes. Okay, we are in Longyearbyen, and this is Isfjorden. It goes way left and right from the village. It is not an unusual high Nordic village, but it started as a coal mining town. In fact, Longyearbyen means city of Longyear. Longyear was an American who started a coal mine here. And here is a vestige of one of the old coal mines. And here is a reminder of the coal mines, a gondola that carried coal for miles down to the port. And then to the right, a reminder that coal mining is a dangerous business. Snowmobiles, I heard about snowmobiles somewhere in one of those earlier talks. There are probably 5 times more snowmobiles than there are cars in Longyearbyen. This is summer, of course, so they're just waiting. The snowmobiles are not the only way to get around. There's a few people that still use dog sleds. This building that you see is the university, UNIS. It is a marine science university, and it's quite modern. And they even allow Americans sometimes to lecture there. And don't talk to me about Second Amendment, because if you even think about walking out of the village, you will be carrying one of these. These students just put their rifles down when they go to class. Well, then to get to Ny-Ålesund, we have to take a rather small plane. This is the plane that we take, and it's pretty small, but the good news is that there is no middle seats. You don't have to worry about it. But the bad news is, if you forget your earplugs, you probably can't hear anything for 2 or 3 days. We're flying over Svalbard, and in spite of global warming, it still has a fair amount of snow and ice over the top, and we emerge at Kongsfjorden. You see glaciers moving into the fjord. And this is this is right before we land there. This is the village, and this, as you'll see in a moment, is one of the research stations. This is a research station named for somebody that many of you know very well, especially those of you that are oceanographers, because after World War II, the Norwegian Polar Institute had to get new leadership. All the old leadership were Nazis from the war. They needed to bring somebody in. They brought in a Norwegian who was very well known, who happened to be spending his time in San Diego at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. His name was Sverdrup, and this is the Sverdrup station. He took over the institution, and they named the station after him when it was built several years after he had died. This is where I did a lot of my work. You can't get away from Amundsen, can you? I mean, he's right in the center of the village. And you can't have a station on a fjord without a marine biology lab. And so this is the marine biology lab. And this is the central administration. This is the mess hall where everybody eats. There is a Norwegian station, but there are 11 other stations representing Italy, France, Germany, Britain, China, Korea, India, Holland, Japan. I'm probably missing one or two. We all eat together in the same mess hall. And on Saturday, they pull out the tablecloths and put out the wine glasses, and we're allowed to drink wine with dinner as long as we buy it at the company store. But we still have a great time. In the checkered shirt, that's Geir Gabrielsen. Now, this is a mountain behind the village, and what I want you to look at is that. That is an atmospheric station that is about a half a kilometer above us, and you can see it better from this plane shot. It's pretty interesting. This is it. I took this picture for John Yin. Did I ever show it to you, John? No. Well, too bad.
There you go.
Taken in 2012, and I really had the best intentions. It is a remarkable station. This is the Spitsbergen Atmospheric Station, and a lot of data that we get on climate change comes from here. And I want to show you this again, because if you look carefully, you can see this support for the cable that holds the gondolas. This is a really unique support because, no, it's not like here. This is Disneyland. You see these supports that are every 200 feet, right? When we're up on the mountain, there's the gondola. There's the support. That's the only tower. That is the single only tower in the place. And if something goes wrong, it could be devastating, right? These guys they're in that gondola, they're pretty happy about it. That's because they haven't yet gotten their safety training. The safety training for us here at USD, it takes like days. Up there, it takes about a minute. It's really just 4 words. You might consider prayer. You know, but this is the view from the gondola. You're looking down. You're trying not to think of a 500-foot drop here, but it is spectacular. Of course, the fjord in Svalbard ought to have glaciers. It has about 5 glaciers coming in. It used to have about, excuse me, about 10. But as you get close, you start realizing how big these are. We're about 1.5 to 2 miles away right now. And here we're almost a half mile from this thing. It's about 100 to 200 meters tall. And of course, it calves icebergs, which are not nearly the size of the Greenland icebergs, but they are interesting. Of course, in order to get this close, you have to be dressed properly. So nobody goes out without a survival suit. If you fall in the water with one of these things on, you'll float, you'll stay warm, it sends out a radio signal. Unless you have a placebo radio, we never knew which was which. This is for Mike Mayer, because I want to now take you into some wildlife, and Mike had told you that there were flowers in the tundra, and there you go. That's it. We're done. No more plants. Okay, animal. We're going to look at some mammals. The reindeer come right into the village. Of course, bearded seals. On an ice floe, there are no more ice floes in the fjord. This is 2012. But when you look at one of these guys closely, you realize he really ought to be called mustachioed seals, shouldn't they? And there was a lot of talk at the village about who had the better mustache. Well, anyway, now without ice floes, polar bears can't hunt seals. And so they have turned to eating eggs. And so here we have a polar bear approaching an eider duck, which thinks it's going to protect its clutch. But of course, that ain't going to happen. These guys can go through about 30 nests with about 5 eggs, 4 or 5 eggs apiece in them. To see how big an egg is, you need to see another mammal, actually. This is an Arctic fox in its summer pelage. There's a little bit of its own winter coat that hasn't quite come off yet. But it's holding an eider egg in its mouth. It's going to go bury it, because in the winter, when it's dark, it's going to smell where it buried those eggs, and that's what it's going to eat. And that's an eider. Actually, this is the female on the nest. Normally, males are never around, but this male, it just wanted to get in the picture, so it's there. This is an auk. It's a guillemot. I would show you a puffin, but I never got a picture of one. But there are a lot of auks in the area. Barnacle geese. And these are kittiwakes. These kittiwakes are loafing on a little piece of ice while they're supposed to be out feeding, so they can bring food to their brood in the nests. And this is where they are when they're on their nests. They're on cliff faces. This is a way that they can get away from most predators, but not humans, because we know how to catch them. We use really long poles with nooses on the end, and that's how we got the kittiwakes that we worked with some years ago. And this is where we start to shift gears a little bit, and I'll start to slow down and tell you a little bit about my current research on the Arctic tern. This is an Arctic tern. This is another Arctic tern. You can see it's marked. We're trying to tell one from another. This mark with indelible ink was gone 2 dives later, so that didn't work too well. But we did have these tramps that our Dutch collaborators loaned us, and the bird would land on its nest, and it would move just a little bit, and it would be captured on that camera there. And when it moved, it was caught. And the next thing you know, we had ourselves a tern. So this is myself and Geir Gabrielson. And here we are again, and this is, we were measuring metabolic rates. And so we would put, I know this is not really an Arctic tern, but it was the only picture I could find quickly. But it was the same principle. We would put the bird in a chamber, we would run air by it, and we would see how much oxygen was taken out of that airstream to measure metabolic rates. Well, this brings me to science. So I just need to explain something, and bear with me, we can figure this out. We're going to come to understand metabolic rates, because it's really important for the story. We in this room, and all mammals and all birds, are what we call endotherms. We are able to maintain a high body temperature by virtue of our own metabolic machinery, unlike reptiles and fish and amphibians, insects and so forth, which get their body temperature from the environment around them. Now we do this by really cranking up our ability to utilize energy, and this is simply a metabolic profile which shows you what happens at different temperatures. So what we're going to see is that there is a certain range of temperatures, this temperature down here, there's a certain range of temperatures in which we're comfortable. We call it the thermoneutral zone. We can change anywhere in that temperature zone without it affecting our metabolism. And for us, that's probably from the low to mid 70s till the maybe mid 80s. But when it gets colder, it challenges our ability to maintain body temperature. So to do that, we have to kick up the metabolic rate. So metabolic rate is the red line, and as it gets colder, metabolic rate goes up, and it goes up at a specific kind of a slope. This gives us a way of understanding heat balance. So MR is metabolic rate, and that is heat production. And on the right side of the equal sign is heat loss. And that is, as you might expect, the differential between the body and the environment. So if the body is at one temperature and the environment's much colder, then heat is leaving the body. So that is the loss, and it's conditioned by some coefficient that we're going to talk about. Now, to make sense of all this, I need to walk you through three things. One is basal metabolic rate. Two is what we call thermal conductance, and three is what we call the lower critical temperature. Or you'll be with me. What is basal metabolic rate? Well, it is the minimal metabolic rate. It is the rate that you find in an endotherm that's at rest. It has no food in its gut because digestion costs energy, and it is, excuse me, it's in that thermoneutral zone. It's in that comfort zone. Whoops. So it is the lowest level. So when we pull it out over to here, this is the basal level of metabolic rate, basal metabolic rate. It is set by natural selection. This is an evolutionary kind of thing, and it's different for different species. And it's influenced by latitude, where latitude is really a proxy for climate. And so here's some work I did a long time ago, but what you see is a bunch of data points, each of which represents either a tern species, or a species of gull, or a species of auk. These are all related seabirds. Now we're going to get to the Arctic term. Because what you see here is degrees of latitude. I don't care whether we're headed for the South Pole or the North Pole. And here we're moving toward the equator. And we have all of these birds. So the Ålesund is really high up there. It's at 79 degrees, so almost 80 degrees north. So we expect then that the basal metabolic rate for an Arctic tern should be at the appropriate place for its latitude. But it really is down here. Now that's still a modestly high metabolic rate, but it's where you would expect a bird at about 55 degrees latitude to be. And that's interesting because the southern range of their breeding distribution is Holland, which is 55 degrees. So they seem equipped in terms of their metabolic rate to live in the Netherlands, but it is a push to imagine how they're getting away with that. All right, let's go back to this graph and let's look at the slope of this line. We call this thermal conductance. It's a coefficient. And what's interesting is, remember, once you drop below that thermal neutral zone and it gets colder, you feel colder and you need to kick up your metabolism to keep your body temperature where it belongs. Well, imagine that you're in that situation and you have two choices. You can wear a t-shirt or you could wear a down jacket, right? Or if you're old enough to remember a fur coat, whichever. Now, if you are wearing a down jacket, as it gets colder and colder, it's not going to bother you very much compared to the person wearing a t-shirt. And that brings us to a recognition that this slope that we call thermal conductance is the inverse of insulation. That is if you look here, if you're only gradually getting your metabolic rate up, it must be because you're well insulated. Well, this was developed for mammals by a fellow 75 years ago named Scholander. And when you look at this graphic, these slopes all represent thermal conductances. And he and his colleagues compared the tropics and the Arctic regions. And what you see is these very steep slopes for tropical organisms and very shallow slopes suggesting very good insulation for Arctic organisms. So now let's look at some thermal conductances. This is all work that was done by Gerrit Gabrielsen several years ago, and he looked at thermal conductance. You don't have to worry about absolute numbers. You don't have to worry about units here. We're just looking at a relative thing because here we have a gull, the black-legged kittiwake, which I showed you before, a fomar, which is a relative of an albatross, and two auks. There are their thermal conductances. They're low. Let's look at the Arctic tern. Oh, whoa, wait a second. The Arctic tern has a thermal conductance 2 to 3 times higher. So the Arctic tern does not have a very high metabolic rate for the climate it's in and has lousy insulation. So what's going on here? Well, I need to take you to just one more thing, and that is the lower limit of this thermal neutral zone, of the comfort zone. Now, this is dictated by the intersection of the basal metabolic line and the thermal conductance line, and this is the temperature below which metabolism has to start increasing. So it's established at that intersection. But what I want you to know is while thermoconductance is a result of natural selection and basal metabolism is a result of natural selection, this is not. This is a consequence of the other two. However, we can go back to the Scholander curve or graphic and look at some lower temperature limits. So if you are a jungle rat, whatever a jungle rat is, you start feeling cold when it's about, oh, let's call it 25 degrees. That's about 77 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? But if you're an Arctic fox in your winter pelage and at rest, you don't start feeling cold until it's 40 below zero. So this is a huge difference. That means the lower critical temperature is a really good index of how well you fit into your environment. Well, here are our polar birds again, right? And notice what their lower critical limit is. Kittiwake doesn't feel like it needs to kick up its metabolism till it gets down to 4.5 degrees. One of the auks can get down to 2 degrees before it feels particularly cold and needs to kick up its metabolism. Let's look at some low latitude birds. So this is Geyer's work. Here is mine. And you can see, when I was younger, I spent all my time in warm climates. What? Somewhere along the line, I got sort of confused, I guess. So, in any event, when you look at these low latitude birds, look, this is what you see. They start feeling cold and they have to kick up their metabolic rate between 25 and 28 degrees. So now, where does it fit for the Arctic tern? Well, I mean, that's ridiculous. In the Allison, it is never 25 degrees. Even when we're having a heat wave and it's in the 50s Fahrenheit, it's 20 degrees below that. What is going on here? This is a bird that is not a polar bird, and it is the icon of the polar region. Here are two Arctic terns just loafing right now, but what you see is they have their heads tucked into their feathers, their shoulder feathers. We call them the scapular feathers, because they're trying to stay warm. They're all fluffed up. These are birds not enjoying their time up here. So what are they doing up there anyway? Well, the answer almost surely is that there's this huge food resource. There are no other terns in the region to compete with, and the zooplankton and the small fish that they eat are really calorie rich. And so what this means is, even if they're cold all the time, the likelihood of good, successful reproduction is high. So global warming, you gotta figure, right? Gotta be the best news they ever heard about. Well, it's not great news. It's not great news for Arctic terns because, first, the Barents Sea around Svalbard and many of the other northern areas are undergoing what we call Atlantification. The polar waters are being pushed further and further north, and remember, we're already at nearly 80 degrees. And Atlantic water is coming in, bringing Atlantic species, which are not fact, they run on average about a quarter the caloric content of the Arctic species. Arctic tern populations have been reported to be collapsing everywhere. So we have asked the question, well, we have posed the hypothesis that what has happened is with their bad thermal situation and the need for high caloric diets, not only to reproduce but to survive, this is no longer such a great place. We have now proposed to start looking at their diet. That's what I hope to do this summer. Ultimately, we have to ask why Arctic terns are so poorly suited for polar life. This is a different question than one I asked before. This is the question that is, how did they end up there? And where did they come from? And I suspect, but this is going to take a long time to really be able to get at, I suspect that they evolved relatively recently at low latitudes. Their entire physiology is a low latitude physiology. And I think they just started following food resources and ended up in the northern and southern polar regions and began migrating between them. But when you look at their migration pattern, they actually do spend an appreciable amount of time at lower and mid latitudes. And we know that because we put these geolocators on them, and we now know where they're going. So here we are up in the Svalbard, and when they move south, they stop in the North Atlantic to feed for a while, and then they move and they spread out through the South Atlantic, and they spend an appreciable amount of time in these two areas feeding before they go to the Antarctic. They also fly very low. Most birds that fly long distances are flying very high where it's really cold, but these birds have to feed constantly, so they're always close to the ocean surface. They are seeing much warmer temperatures, and so maybe this is part of it. In any event, why are they so poorly suited? Well, these are two possibilities, but maybe we just don't know. I want to finish up by just saying some generalities about what we've been learning about through the frozen realm, because this is our last time, right? Is Svalbard really warming? To what extent is Svalbard warming? Well, the glaciers are shrinking, I already told you that, and we see them collapsing all the time. But here's something I showed people when we talked about the oceans, and it's worth looking at one more time. This is a view across Kongsfjorden over a 100-year period. So here we are in 1918, and the fjord just does not look that big because it's so close from where Ny-Ålesund is to the other side by virtue of those glaciers. But let's look 80 years later. And all of a sudden, the fjord, fjord looks a little bigger. And then only 17 years after that, and so there are some really big changes. There is no sea ice at all in Svalbard anymore. There's a little bit of thin ice in the winter, but nothing like there used to be. Here's my final slide, thankfully, right? That I think you'll enjoy this. This is Longyearbyen again. That's the World Seed Bank. The World Seed Bank was put in Longyearbyen Because first you needed space, and second you needed coal. And the space comes from abandoned coal mines, and the cold comes from the permafrost of the tundra. So what is all that stuff around there? Those are refrigeration units. The tundra, the top part of the permafrost is melted. And now to keep the seed bank cool, it has to be done artificially. And that's the canary that we should be thinking about when we think about global warming and climate change. So that's it. Thank you very much.